Yeah, I'm here.
I knew Brad had wanted to.
Thanks, Brad.
Bit.
And good afternoon, Frankston City. We are well past the midpoint of the campaign, well past the halfway point, well past, we've got a week to go. This is a conversation where we're going to be talking about inclusion and local government. And there's a whole raft of issues for us to discuss. Before we get underway, and I'm going to ask Sue to kick us off with this conversation today, but before we get underway, I just wanted to flag that we have also invited Rupinder Singh to join us as well, but he may or may not be able to join us because I know he's got work commitments. Just so people are aware, I did have a sitting councillor who did approach me about joining us on here, but we did take the decision that this was about new candidates for this particular forum. So as a result, we've declined that request. The sitting councillors have had 4 years to make their case. And so given the current environment, we felt it was better for these discussions, in particular, to be an opportunity for us to make our case. So I do acknowledge that they did reach out. And the other thing, of course, would have been that if we'd had one sitting councillor join, then I would have had all the sitting councillors also making the same request. So I hope that's everyone understands why I've taken that decision. And it was a decision that I did discuss with the other candidates on who are taking part in these forums. So we went with the majority approach. Before we get underway, and it's something that I have to apologise for first because we started doing it and then it dropped off. But I would like to first pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, who are the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation, and pay respect to their elders past, present, and emerging. It's something that too easily we forget to do, particularly when we're out of practice doing it, but also part of inclusion is about even just trying to mentally remember that there are others who are not like us and have differences in our community and in every aspect of our lives as well. But to kick this off, I'd actually like to pass the baton to Sue, and we can get the conversation underway.
Great. Thanks, Stephen, and hello to everyone. Welcome again to another Candid Conversation, where today we decided to focus on the very broad topic of inclusion. And it is a very broad topic. And under that banner, we are going to move across all sorts of issues such as gender equity and what that means. There's new legislation that's come out this year which will impact the lens that council has on its own staff, of which there are just short of 1,000 staff. So we can talk about gender equity and what that means and what that looks like for us as a group. It also includes disability, and with the current Royal Commission, which is looking at all aspects around violence, abuse, neglect and exploitation of people with disability. Certainly for our community, there will be people who live with disability through the whole cycle, youngsters through to people who are elderly. So having a mind to what that means for us as a group of councillors if we're elected, that's another lens to look through. Equally, we have our LGBTQI community, and I noticed this week that there was a news item on council raising the flag and flying that outside the council offices. So again, part of our inclusive lens through which we need to look at our community. And additionally, there is the whole question of race, religious beliefs, and really it includes people who are different from us. It's very easy to view the world through the lens of white female, but actually I recognise that I only represent 50% of the population as a female, so I have to broaden out my lens. And in fact, on all the other issues I've just mentioned, it's really important that we we look through different lenses all the time to ensure our policies, procedures, our approach to community includes everybody. So with that said, just to kind of set the landscape for the breadth of discussion, perhaps I'll throw over to one of the team here to talk about some of their experiences on one of those topics. There are a few that I've mentioned, but to throw it open to a topic, and Justin has indicated the talking stick there, so go for it, Justin.
Love the word talking stick, Sue. Thank you. One thing I'd love to congratulate the council on in particular, and this is I guess the council business, nothing to do, well, I shouldn't say nothing to do, but focusing on the council business itself is something that I've experienced and something that I've seen, which relates to my neighbour who's in her mid to late 80s. She's on her own now. Council provide a service for based on age and based on ability, because I don't like to use the word disability, based on their ability within their framework to be able to provide services and support for those sort of people. And when I say those sort of people, to qualify that, is people that may not be able to do day-to-day tasks that most of us here would take for granted. Where I grew up and where I'm from, this isn't a service that's around. It's not something that I would consider a normal service. I consider that a value-added service in terms of what council offers. So this is putting it very simplistically, and there's probably a lot more to it, but sort of what I have seen is there are tasks around her home that help her to remain independent, to help her remain, I don't want to say the word relevant, but let's explore that sort of word for a moment, and being able to be self-sufficient in her home is an absolute resource. I couldn't imagine anywhere else that doesn't have it. And then there's the sort of flow-on effects in terms of engagement as well. So it's not just, hey, I'll come around to your house and do some bits and bobs, so then you can, we can tick you off the list and say that you're independent. It's more, it's how can we engage with you? How can we bring these people together to engage with each other? And it all comes back, the list of disability, age, families, financial, housing, mental support, mental health, gender, sexual preference, race, religion. There's one word that jumps out at all of that, and that's community. Community is what ties all of us together, and it certainly doesn't take any preference over how you look, who you are, your financial background, the colour of your skin, where your parents originated from, anything. This is community. Community, it makes up all of those sections. Community makes up all of those inclusions. And look, quite frankly, I'm proud to be a part of that community that does include a lot of it. I think there is still a lot more we can do in terms of inclusion and sort of broadening off. And I don't want to steal the mic for too long here, but in terms of the age, the families, the housing and financial is definitely something I think we can work on. But for now, I'm happy to stop there and pass it on to somebody else.
Great, thanks, Justin. That's super. Who's up next? Stephen, I can see you've got your mic off.
I don't have my mic off, but I think Peter was actually in front of me. He hasn't quite got the spoon yet, but
Okay, thanks. So when I showed this before, I just wanted to demonstrate I also had a talking stick, but I'm happy to say a few words. I just want to introduce something else into the conversation with all this, with the inclusion. There's a few things I'd like to introduce, but I'll just go with one at the moment. And that is there's sort of an intersection between inclusiveness and privacy. And it's an interesting intersection. And it can be difficult because a person has a right to privacy, has a right to, not indicate how they might be a little different to others, or they can sort of their sexuality, anything, whether or not they possibly have some Asperger's on the spectrum somewhere. We run into this down at the TAFE Institute, but you could run into it anywhere. And I just got to say, you've got to be very ready for be careful, because somebody might be on the spectrum or have a different sexuality, but it's their right to privacy. That can be a private thing for them. However, if something happens and you notice you know, for some reason or other that they are different to you, or in a group, you know, that you don't belong to for one reason or another, you have to be ready to not react in a bad way, or possibly not even react. And it just, personal stories, I think, are really good to demonstrate these things. You know, where, I mean, I was very sure that somebody in a class I had had Asperger's. And gee, I'll tell you what, some of them make very good scientists. And I love this kid. He was wonderful, very quiet and shy. And finally, he was under 18. He might have been 17 and a half. His mother did tell me about halfway through the course. And I mean, I was happy to be able to say to her, look, I realised that, yeah, certainly he was different, but that didn't matter to me in many ways. But I did have to behave differently for him. The inclusiveness there, in fact, was to, because I understood that he needed to get out of the classroom sometimes, because noise was a problem for him, a lot of noise sometimes, and I respected that. So we can have protocols, rules, regulations about this, but we also have to be a little bit learned ourselves. And you actually referred to it a bit, Sue. We have to be a bit learned, a little bit learned about this and what different groups of people are like, perhaps. And it's our own education, so that we are aware and we can be sensitive in our inclusiveness.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Peter. Yeah, and education, I think, is a key part in all of this. The more you have information or knowledge. I remember years ago when I did a couple of years working with ANZET at the very end of their time here in Australia. We ran a program on understanding disability amongst cabin crew and in flight. And the biggest change for people was around the language and how you actually use words. Not someone's blind, for example, but they have a vision impairment. So, you know, it moves you away from really understanding someone's issues, and then even how you have a conversation with someone who might not banter the same way you, but it's really listening, understanding, paying attention, asking what someone else needs rather than presupposing what you think they need and giving them that. So it is a big educational learning curve, I think, on all these areas. Brad, you wanted to go next, I saw.
What I learned, as a lot of you know, I was a counsellor years ago, and what I learned very quickly on, and what any new counsellor will learn very quickly, is how diverse our community actually is. Living in my house, in my street as a normal resident, I wasn't exposed to all of the groups, the organisations, the people who receive services and use services from the council, and quickly you know, my idea of what community actually is changed and broadened very quickly. So, you know, it changed my outlook on my life, and not just in Frankston, but the council is a lot more than just roads, rates and rubbish. We've all kinds of people out there helping others, unsung heroes that you never hear about, looking after people who are disabled. Our community houses especially, yeah, their doors are open, anyone who wants to walk in. The classes they run, the groups they coordinate, all funded, at least a lot of that coordination activities by Frankston Council. And there's a lot of people out there whose lives have been completely turned around through those services that the council provides. Look, I'll just give you a couple of examples that come to mind. There was a guy, in a community house. I was invited to visit the community house not long after my election up in Orwell Street, Frankston. I don't know if you've ever heard of Orwell Street Community House. I'd never heard of it. I went in there, had a chat to them. There was a bloke out in the back room writing their newsletter, and his eyesight was I mean, he was legally blind, but through a special interface to the computer, he was able to write the newsletter, right? So he felt useful, right? He wasn't sitting at home, or he was actually a part of it. That kind of a difference, even if it's only to a small handful of people, changes lives. And the people who are volunteering at that community house to make that type of thing happen, it doesn't happen by itself. That young man and his situation has stuck in my mind ever since. That was now 12 years ago. He was, the disability I had, I don't know how I would be able to cope, without my vision. I wouldn't have my career. I wouldn't have a lot of things. He got off his rear end, was in at the community house. He was able to make his way there and pack all by himself. And, it wasn't really a massive outlay for the council at all. I remember I was contacted by some people who weren't ambulant in the community. That's a term they use now when you're not mobile, when you're perhaps something with your legs, or too overweight, or whatever it is, and they were unable to use the outdoor pool up in the Pines because of that. So through a little bit of ratepayers' money, he was able to organise a hoist, and now those people are able to use the pool. They're out there. They have become mobile, leaving the house, getting some exercise. There's all kinds of little things here and there that as a normal resident, you're more worried about your rubbish collection and the units that are proposed up the street or whatever it is. But there's amazing things happening out there by amazing people, and that absolutely has to be supported by the council. And as councillors, we need to make sure that type of thing continues. We can't allow that to fall by the wayside because you are dead set on reducing costs or lowering rates or whatever. There's stuff out there that changes lives, and I just urge all of you who are running for council, take an interest in that, listen, ask questions, and make things happen.
Great, thank you, Brad. Shane, I think we're going across to you next.
Oh, cool. Thank you very much. I apologise. I was at work and I had to move between where I was. So, but now I'm all good. The interesting thing about the inclusion, and obviously when we discussed that we're going to have this discussion, the two things that kind of jumped out at me was when I had the business going down at the waterfront was the chair for disabled kids to come down so they can actually enjoy the beach. And I've never seen so big a smiles. You know what I mean? Like, it's things like that the council can add and get access to, that therefore can bring joy. Like, there's a lot of things, rates, this and this, but the council's ability to go the other way and actually improve, even a day out at the beach, even, at certain reserves, you have, the freedom swing and stuff for people in wheelchairs as well. So I'm thinking if we kept that momentum going, and then that'll obviously improve the access for a lot of different things. And yeah, so they were the two things that really strung out, like just really popped out at me. And especially because firsthand, and then, so there you go. Thanks for that.
Great, thank you. Yeah, and I noticed that the council does have a disability access and inclusion committee who aim to meet every couple of months. So I'd be really interested to find out more about the sorts of topics that come to them and what kind of latitude they have in making suggestions. I did have one person in my ward approach me about their mum's wheelchair. She has got an electric wheelchair now to help her get around. But one thing that got in her way was height of the curbs. There are old curbs in the area where she lives. So the wheelchair doesn't have enough grunt, and they're pretty powerful, pretty robust pieces of equipment, but not enough power to get up the curb. So that for me, you know, is probably one of many small little things. It's probably not so small, and there obviously is a cost, and there needs to be a plan around making changes like that. But to ensure neighbourhoods are more accessible, people can get around them. You can get out of your house and go down the road to your friend. You know, when we're allowed to do that again, just makes a difference, as you're all saying, to someone's feeling of engagement, joy, energy, involvement with their community. So
I've also noticed the footpath maintenance, you know, when they go around and they spray and they've got all the stuff, like even that makes a difference. You know, the trees over the footpaths, the crossing paths and all that stuff, you know, with the rumbles and all the rumble strips and all that. It's just accessible where it used to be steps. I remember as a kid, there used to be steps everywhere, but now it seems like they're kind of, there's access and then there's the stairs. So hopefully that's changing a pattern where moving forward, it's more about everyone's abilities, different, you know, abilities that make it, you know, so that's just the way it goes. So,
Can I quickly jump in before you
then
jump,
Stephen? And then we'll go to Stephen,
Yeah, it's just off the back of what you're saying. So I spoke to the same gentleman and around the wheelchair, and I'll freely admit it, it's something that I had absolutely never considered. And I said that to him straight off the bat. It's, as somebody, I suppose, that's able-bodied and have never had to put myself in that position when he was talking about, you know, his mum and buying that wheelchair in order to facilitate her still being independent and being able to do her shopping and all that sort of thing as well. Yeah, it makes you start to think and you go, well, okay, how many areas does that actually represent? And I hate using the word assume, but I assumed in the year 2020 that, you know, small things like our footpaths were inclusive of people with wheelchairs or people with mobility issues, or look, even if we look on a simpler term, somebody with a pram. I've been on the receiving end of that too, having to get off the curb and back over the curb. Everybody else seems to make it look really easy, and I found that very challenging. But no, it's an absolutely brilliant point. So, and just to tie in a couple of things, and I'll stop, which is what Brad said, what Sue said, and Peter and Steve and Shane, or everybody said, I suppose, is we're talking about a value-based prospect. And it's not a financial value-based prospect, it's a value-based prospect.
Yes, great. Thanks, Justin. Stephen, over to you.
Thank you, Sue. I, you know, just listening to what everyone has said and just kind of reflecting a bit on a lot of the work that I've done over, well, it's more than just the work I've done more recently, you know, in sort of the humanitarian space, working in different communities around the world. But even before that, I did a lot of work in sort of vocational education, and I'd be going into workplaces, quite often working with people who had English as a second language or had different ability levels and so on. And the thing that strikes me is that the inclusion isn't about saying that everyone has to be able to participate. Inclusion isn't about making concessions for people. It's about actually taking an approach which is that everyone in our community actually has a right to participate. It's about recognizing as well that diversity has many different layers. So it's not just about gender. It's not just about ability. It's not just about the things that you might be good at or the things you might not be so good at. It's not just about ethnicity or religion or any of these things. It's actually all of those things put together. So, you know, there'd be somebody who looks like me, sort of middle-aged white man, who's had the benefit of a good education and a relatively privileged life in relation to somebody else. But you don't necessarily see what's going on in the inside or for that person in different ways. It's also about thinking about, there are a huge number of people in our community who are carers, and they are very often, they're invisible. So they may not necessarily have that particular concern or issue that they are dealing with as an individual, but they are caring for others in our community or in their own household or in their own family that do have some of these challenges. And so inclusion's about making sure that we're open to all of those different perspectives. And for a lot of us, if we're elected to council, we're not necessarily going to have lived experience of that. So how we consult with and engage with people, and if I think about a lot of the work that I've done over the last 15 years in particular, where we've been working in communities around the world where that have been affected by a crisis, you quite often find that the people that you need to proactively engage with and listen to are the ones who are least visible as well. And I think that's where council can make a real difference, because we're working, when you think about the people that in a very generalized sense, use our council services, they're very often the ones who have those hidden vulnerabilities that aren't necessarily being called out. And I think that's really, really important, that as a council, whether we're talking about business as usual, rates, roads, footpaths, rubbish, all of those kinds of things, think about things such as a recycling bin. Okay, if you're somebody who has limited mobility, they're quite high. It's not necessarily easy for you to take that out to the road. I will sometimes help with my neighbours to get theirs out onto the road if they're too heavy for them. I do that with my parents when I'm allowed to go and see them under the current restrictions. These are all the things that we need to be thinking about when we're thinking about this issue of inclusion. And the more inclusive we are, the more we have a respect for the diversity of our community. And I think that's really quite critical. If I make one final point, because I'm going off on a little bit of a rant here as well, because it's an issue that's particularly close to my heart, is that if you come from a position of privilege, like most of us on this call do, you need to make a conscious effort to think of the perspective of somebody else and how they would do that. And that's beyond roads, rates, rubbish. That's about the very, whether it's a planning scheme. Does the planning scheme actually encourage inclusive development? Does a social program that's being supported by council, is it actually designed in a way that makes it as accessible to as many people as possible? Or let's take a council meeting, for example. If a council meeting is well run and people are being respectful of each other, there's a higher likelihood that people are going to be willing to put public submissions in and come and speak to council, because they're not going to feel threatened by that. And it takes courage for people to do that, even in what is commonly referred to as safe spaces. And this isn't about being woke in any way. This is actually about basic human decency and respect. Sorry, I've gone on a bit of a rant, and I'll stop there.
Yeah, no, all really useful perspectives. And I think, it's very easy to put people into a category like white man, white woman, but actually we all love our individualness. So each of us has a whole set of attributes that makes us quite unique compared to the next person. And when we're rushing through life and busy with everything, it's very easy to categorize people very quickly in order to deal with them and the issue, as opposed to just taking a little bit of time and saying, what are their specific needs and what are their issues and how do they view the world and how best can they engage and how do they need to be supported? So using a position which gives you some power and influence in a supportive, constructive way, rather than just to promote your own agenda and your own little group. So I think well said, Stephen. Peter, you wanted to comment?
Yeah, look, just a couple of things. I mean, there's so many things come into this, and just then what sort of comes to my mind is identity. We all have our own identity, and all our identities are different. We want our own identity. The other thing is that, you get tripped up every now and then. And you forget something, and we're all fallible. That's why if you have a good group of inclusive people to we're reminding each other or picking something up that somebody else hasn't thought of, that is a good thing. Now, particularly on council, and that's where I want to introduce the term form over substance. You can have I've seen it in organisations, as you guys probably have, you can have great sort of stuff there on the wall or wherever, and you can have great protocols and, new legislation about inclusiveness. And, that can be then filtered down and formulated into policies, etc. Now, there's also the overuse of the term culture. Culture, we need to change the culture. Well, yes, we do. Now, it's a generalised term, and everybody uses it. You can have two people on either side of the table saying, we need to change the culture. We need to change. They may mean two different types of culture and two different things in reality. So in concrete terms, we need to change people's behaviour, change people's awareness, and particularly on council, without going too much back over the past, I think maybe a new council does need to act in accordance with principle and in accordance with their own protocols. I certainly seem to remember times when that didn't, I don't think that was happening. And that goes to Stephen's point about how are the public going to feel about coming forward? How are people going to feel about coming forward to us as councillors? You can have all these lovely principles there, but if there's not a good reception or people don't even feel they'll be received, it's virtually useless. It's a start maybe, but if you don't follow through with behaviour, there's a real problem. So more substance. Form is good, but you need the substance, and rhetoric and reality. You need to get the reality going, not just have the rhetoric.
Indeed. Yeah. Stephen, you wanted to say?
I was just wanting to pick up on Peter's point around, we all have our own identity, but actually one of the key lessons that I've learned over the last, 40 odd years. So since I was little, I'm not going to say how old I am, but is that there are multiple layers of identity that somebody has. So you talk about that kind of intersection of different kinds of inclusion and diversity, but on the one hand, professionally, I have an identity as a humanitarian, and that's what I do. I also have an identity as a leadership specialist. I also have an identity as a firefighter because of what I do in my spare time. I also have an identity as a father, and so on. And at any one time, if you're thinking about this idea of inclusion, you're actually incorporating all these different identities. And so you can't just say, right, Peter, you're in this box. You're ex-Navy or only recently ex-Navy, and therefore you must have a particular mindset. Or Justin, your profession's real estate. Therefore, you are a particular type of person. But actually, life is much more complex than that, and it's about those both visible identities, but also those invisible identities that we all carry with us. And I think that as counsellors, we need to be as open and authentic about what our different identities are, because that makes others comfortable about sharing their identity and their perspective with us as well.
Yeah. Thanks, Stephen. And it's interesting just looking at the screen at the moment from where I'm sitting and everybody looking in. To me, there's a very obvious set of boxing that can be done around male and female. Now, none of us probably want to declare our sexual preferences today, or talk about what disabilities we're carrying, or what race or ethnic groups our families come from, and all those things. To discover that, we'd need to have a conversation, and we'd need to explore that in more detail. But just looking at the screen today, there's one female and there's 5 males in this conversation. And one of the things that is getting a lot of press, and particularly around the council elections, has been this notion of gender equity. And there is some new legislation that's come out this year that's going to require council to plan and report on and look at how do they create a working environment for their 990 plus staff that they have that enables everyone to have a fair crack at the opportunities that are available. So it's not about just selecting people on the basis of their gender just because there's a vacancy available for a position. ability, competence, all of that needs to come into it. But it is about creating environments where everybody can have a fair go and they're not disadvantaged. So to give you an example of that, the federal budget this week has had a little bit of criticism around some of the money that's going to be put towards apprenticeships and traineeships for young people. And the concern is that it's targeting traditionally male workplaces or male opportunities for work. So again, it's having that lens. It's looking at if we have a policy or an approach, is it setting us up to provide opportunities for everybody in the community, or is it maybe unconsciously just limiting people's ability to apply because they're actually not in that target audience, or that target audience has been defined inadvertently. So this sort of notion of gender equity is real. With our council elections, I think across Victoria, women represent less than 25% of candidates, whereas we make up around 50% of the population. And again, the challenge has been that maybe women at home, juggling family, education, dealing with domestic violence issues, a whole range of circumstantial events inadvertently, disproportionately mean that women don't put their hands up to get involved with something like the council elections. So we as a group of people who may end up on council will have that to look at, I think. So yeah, that, just by way of introduction to it's not an elephant in a room, but it's, it is an issue of inclusivity that will be relevant to certainly half our population in Frankston. Stephen.
I think that's a fantastic point, and actually a bit of a segue as well about the link back between inclusion and culture. And I think that, it's really important that we acknowledge that as a group here on the screen, we are not particularly diverse, and we're not particularly reflective of the broader community either, whether that be gender or anything else. I should flag we have invited other candidates to join us, but for whatever reason, they're unable to do so. But that's not an excuse either. And I'd be curious about your own experience of this, Sue, but one of the things that struck me is that part of the culture of local government, part of the culture of local politics is such that I get and it may only be anecdotal, but I get the impression that female candidates get a much harder time of it than male candidates do. I might be wrong, and it's based only on sort of anecdotal evidence, but I do recall that, very early on in the campaign, before formal nominations were done, I was talking to a female candidate who ultimately withdrew because of the behaviour of other candidates towards her. I think, Sue, you and I are also part of a Facebook group which is around supporting more women into local government, and some of the reports I've seen on there are really, quite frankly, horrific in terms of how some women are being treated just in the campaign, let alone when they're actually holding office. Have you had those kinds of experiences on this campaign?
I must say, maybe it's my age, level of maturity, outlook on life. I tend to be quite pragmatic about issues like that. I made a note today actually to sort of mention the notion of feminism, and feminism actually just being about everybody having an equal opportunity. And the earliest feminist who really influenced me and my outlook was my dad. And my dad was an awesome supporter of me as a female, being the first in our family to go to university, entering workplaces that were male dominated as a young graduate, getting involved with all sorts of environments that had a high proportion of men, sporting environments, supporting committees for, I have a son, so I've been around lots of male sporting environments. So I work hard to be equal and to call things out when I see them, but that isn't always easy, because often you can be seen as the killjoy or the person that is just dampening a bit of hilarity around a situation. So I think, so the short answer is no, but I'm in this campaign, but I am very aware of some of the reasons why women won't put their hands up. But balance that out with just a little sort of side note. I watched something on the Australian Human Rights Commission report on workplace sexual harassment about a month ago, and their Respect at Work report. It talks about sexual harassment, women to men, men to women. It's not just women that are on the receiving end of abuse or difficulties at work. It can happen in either direction. So it is an issue for us all to talk about and mention. And again, back to where we started the conversation today, it's around education, listening, understanding, hearing different points of view. And the more we understand that and have conversations to hear different viewpoints, the better. Yeah, and I just another little story to illustrate that. I remember my son, before he even was a teenager, coming home from playing rugby, I think it was, at school, and he said, "Oh, so and so, he played like a big girl's blouse today. I don't know what got into him, and the team lost, and it was." And I said, "Whoa, slow down. Who didn't play very well? Why didn't they play very well? Oh, so they didn't listen to the coach. They haven't been practicing. They tend to play their own game. They're not being a team player." So that'd be the reasons why that person, your teammate, didn't perform well on the team today. It's got nothing to do with this stereotyping of some article of female clothing, So it's even down to that level of appreciation and understanding. So anyway, I've got on my rant soapbox there as well. But I think they're quite easy, straightforward issues around education, conversation, language. So who's up next? Let me hand over to somebody else for your views.
I think both Peter and Justin were trying to get your attention. So
okay, go for it. Justin, you did it then.
I just wanted to ask, this is a question for you specifically, Sue. You touched on the female candidacy side of things, and it's not something I want to dwell on in terms of specifics, but as a female candidate, and more specifically as a female candidate in our ward, what was the overall feeling for you, and how do you think you were treated any differently or received any differently? Because it's going to sound really blind, but it's not something that I've seen. So I'd love to hear, what your experience was as well.
Well, you and I talk fairly frequently about how the campaign's progressing, and we've both had lots of comments and questions and feedback from candidates, either phoning or writing Facebook messages, texting messages. Nothing has come up that would reference a gender bias from anybody, other than a positive one, as in, would really aware that having a gender balance in council is going to be good for everybody. So that's genuinely the feedback I've had.
Beautiful, thank you.
Yeah. Stephen, Peter, were you next? Yes. Mike, Peter.
You're on mute, Peter.
And then you got to wait for the space bar to go down. It's like going into a shop and the person behind the counter says, "Who was next?" And there's 20 people. Couple of points. I'm going to come out and say that I think what's happened in council over the last 4 years may have had an effect in subduing female candidacy, and so therefore, quickly going on to the future, the way the future council behaves will also affect that, and the way if female candidates do get elected, and I hope they do. We need to behave very, very well, inclusively and fairly. the other thing is I like what Sue said about her father being the feminist. I've got a feminist friend who says there's two theories about that men aren't allowed to be feminists. They can't be called a feminist because they can't experience. I like your idea. I hope I'm a bit of a feminist. I certainly supported my daughter to the fullest extent that I could. And she's, best human being in the world. And she certainly wasn't daunted by the competition. And there's a lot of competition in the legal profession and a lot of sexism in that as well. So she's in Canberra, the Attorney General's Department now, and good on her. And I like the example of women who can make it, get to the top in their profession or really get somewhere, and then be a good example of, how they can operate and something for other women to aspire to. That is a really essential thing. So female candidates, let's hope that some get in, certainly into council, and then let's make it a place, an example of where women can go to and do well and not have any problems from that point of view.
Thanks, Peter. Stephen.
I just wanted to, I know Shane's probably in his ward has probably got a high level of diversity in terms of candidates for council, and I don't want to speak on Rupinder's behalf. I was hoping he'd be able to join this conversation, but hopefully he'll be able to join us on Sunday. But I know from talking to him, and I also know from talking to Shane that he experienced some quite vitriolic, racist comments from people, and I think it's not enough for people like us to say, that's not appropriate. But we actually need to counter that as much as possible, because the diversity of a community adds to its richness. And I think that, if we were to look across the whole of Frankston, from 5 years ago to now, there's much greater diversity across a whole range of different factors than there was 5 years ago. And by the time the next term of council finishes, it'll be even more diverse. And actually, we need to embrace that diversity, because it actually enriches us all. And it also makes us much more adaptable as a community as well. But Shane, given you're in North East Ward, I just wanted to perhaps suggest you chime in there.
Yeah, I'll just make sure I'm off, turned off mute. Yeah, so we'll just say the example that you brought up about that is that I've spoken to Rupinder a couple of times over the course of the campaign, touch base with him, just to see how it was all going, because that's what everyone does. And then to see that kind of the comments that kind of jumped on his feed, and I kind of just said, oh, I'll stay off his feed, and then all of a sudden I just had to say something. So, but after speaking to him, he wasn't kind of that fussed, only because it happens a lot. He goes, it's not just on the page, it's everywhere, and it is just what it is. It's sad that it is. There's a lot of hate. I wouldn't say hate, but there's a lot more passion this time around in the election, only because of what has been going on. Like it or love it, hate it, whatever. So I've been called everything under the sun, and it's nothing to do with gender or anything like that. It's just people lashing out. Plus stage 4, people have just had enough, and they just go, oh, here's Mr. Punching Bag. So in this environment, yeah, you got to have a thicker skin. And I was told that going in that, I'm going to be called a whole lot of stuff. But the inclusion part, especially being, to say, female with all your, the different living conditions, like, looking after kids and all that kind of stuff. That's environmental, but not the inclusion part. The inclusion part is it's open to anyone. You're an Australian citizen, you can nominate for council. There's no prerequisites that take you away from, if it's gender, race, religion, anything like that, you can run. So the thing is, that part of it is on, like in terms of that works, but it's the environment that I don't think the council can really, it's about, the child minding stuff, which we've got all that kind of stuff. It's the environment that stops the people from doing it, especially in this environment where passions are high, emotions are high, plus stage 4. you know, the pandemic and all that stuff, and that's leading to what we have now. But next time, after this next council, I'm assuming, you know, everything will be a lot better. Everything will be calmer with the COVID stuff. Plus, with the new guys coming in, or how the new council will function next, I'm hoping that it's just calm, which means that the stage is set for more inclusion, for everyone else to go, you know what, I'd love to get involved, because you know what, it's proactive, you can get things done. There's no screaming, there's no in the newspapers, there's no nothing, you know, and then that'll lead on to better things for Frankston. And that's the number one reason why I put my hand up is just so that we can just have new voices, a new start, you know. So cool, thank you. I've taken up heaps of your time. So Sue, you wanna have it back?
Yeah, no, that's good. What we'll do, we'll thanks, Shane. That's great. We'll go to Brad, and then I'm just mindful of the time as well, but maybe we can just all do a loop round with some final observations and comments. What do you think, Stephen? Will that work?
This is your gig, Sue. So
excellent.
I leave it in your hands.
It's what us women do. We collaborate. We check in with everyone and make sure we're all going in the same direction. And if not, we'll just bulldoze through anyway. Brad.
Yeah, thanks. Look,
you.
the what was mentioned a little bit earlier was the disproportion of male and female councillors on our council, and I note the current council has 3 women and 6 men, and that ratio has been pretty consistent in at least the last, I don't know, 15 years or thereabouts that I've been watching the council. And it's not because there's a shortage of candidates. Yeah, we might not have quite as many women as men candidates, that's true, but they are there to be elected. But I think, you know, we could use a few more, and I think that this really needs a harder look. I mean, it's quite easy to turn around and just say, oh, well, the candidates there, the voters aren't obviously voting them in, and there's nothing we can do. But I think what is perhaps needed is some kind of action or program to encourage women to stand for council, and you know, perhaps you know, look for women of substance, women of quality, try to enrich, you know, the candidate base, if you like. And I think the council has a role to play in that. I think also the state, who run the Electoral Commission, also have a role to play in that as well, because 3 out of 9 isn't enough. You know, wouldn't it be a nice change to have a majority women council? And it'd be an interesting exercise. Have a look around the state at all the councils around Victoria. How many of them actually have a majority of women on the council? I would suggest not very many. So that's something I'm interested in exploring, but I'm also interested in hearing any other thoughts on what the cause of this state of affairs is, and what we might be able to do to remediate it.
Great, thanks, Brad. Peter, over to you, and off mute.
Thanks again for the reminder. I need it, obviously. Yeah, just a quick one. I just hear what Brad's saying, and it was something I was thinking of too, and it's a sort of a, I don't know whether the term positive discrimination is there. It's a bit of an unpopular term. It's become unpopular with some people. Yeah, women of quality, well, not every man is a man of quality. We are all here, of course. But yeah, the other thing is the number of candidates. I think if you increase the number of candidates, well, it's probably the same proportion as, you know, women of quality as there's men of quality, but the same. But I think more, I think really Brad touched on this, I guess you do need something to get more candidates, more women candidates. And I really think that's important, and that's something that I agree the council should really work at, because they're out there and there must be reasons why more women aren't coming forward. I've seen this in other organisations and we've tried and I don't know what it is. And I sometimes wonder if it's because we're still emerging from a world that isn't quite right as far as gender equity is concerned. It just may be some kind of residual of that, but we need to keep trying. So, yeah, that's my comment.
Thanks, Peter. Justin, over to you.
Thanks, Sue. Look, I've got a really short point to make, and I think everybody's really nailed it really well. But in the 2016 census, the city of Frankston was comprised of 51.2% female. Now, in terms of running for council, and I can't say unequivocally that this is the case, but my personal perception of council was very much a culture of being a boys' club, and I don't think that's necessarily conducive of encouraging women to want to participate. I don't necessarily want to make this about me, but I'll just throw in a quick story just to sort of paint some relevance to it. Is after years of working in the city in fairly progressive companies and equal opportunity employers, when I took my first role in Frankston, was working for a private company down here, and that was a boys' club. And I'd never experienced anything like it in my life. It was as though I'd sort of travelled 30 kilometres down the bay, but I'd gone back 30 years in time. There was, and I won't use any of the colloquialisms, but there was definitely that sense of, oh, look, go and be a good girl. And in 2020, and that was in 2012, 2014, whatever it was, that was unacceptable then. So what makes anybody think that a boys' club and having that sort of dysfunctional culture is not even appropriate, acceptable? Particularly when we come back to the census data saying that more than half of the residents, 4 years ago in fairness, but more than half of the residents in Frankston are female.
Great, thanks, Justin. Stephen, over to you. And you might have been checking the comments and questions as well. Is there anything in there to pick up?
Look, I have been monitoring the comments and questions. So I might just quickly just run through some of those before I kind of give my kind of closing reflection. Joe Price, and I think we may have already covered it in the discussion, but Joe Price was asking about how we'd ensure that the voices of the most vulnerable or marginalised communities are represented when during community consultation. I think that's critically important. I mean, we talked about those people who have particular vulnerabilities that are hidden from view, and it's about making sure that we're actually reaching out. I think. Feel free to disagree with me, anyone. But that's what I think. The role of council is about reaching out. Glenn Cooper's remarked that about the limited support that is actually provided to organisations that support disability in our community, and certainly from talking to a number of community-based organisations over the last couple of weeks, I think there's a clear gap there in terms of the kind of support that's provided, not just in monetary terms, but in terms of other forms of support as well. And I would hope that in a new council, we'd be able to actually look at a much better way of coordinating and supporting those kinds of organisations. Joe Price again, just flagging, it's about looking at the whole of a person, about how that prevents them from participating around, whether it's depression, social anxiety, living in residential care, and so on. Joe shared the bookmark about gender equity, so we were all given it as pre-reading, but for anyone who's watching this, Joe's put a very helpful link in there, so get into it. There is a whole bunch of work as well around things like gender pay gap, and also about how having greater diversity in workplaces and in boards actually makes them more productive as well. And Glenn Cooper, again, very passionate about this particular issue, and I think that it's really important that we have a very broad perspective on what we mean when we talk about inclusion, and that it does go beyond just gender. Oliver Hill, again, I'm starting to feel a little bit concerned about the behaviour of the candidate for West Ward, because it's popping up in every single discussion. And I actually have got a question for the candidate for West Ward about what level of diversity there is going on in West Ward. You know, is it all the fish, or is it just certain types of fish that Oliver Hill will be representing? But, you know, as I said, I'm glad that we've left the space open for some Muppets as well.
And don't forget the crabs.
And don't forget the crabs either. So look, my closing comment, I suppose, is that if we're going to be more inclusive as a council, the organisation, and as a council, the governing body, we actually need to proactively think about inclusion. It almost needs to become part of our checklist. And I think if we start by demonstrating a more inclusive culture as a council governance group, that will actually impact the culture of the organisation more widely. But it also then has a flow-on effect, and just picking up on Shane's point around, you know, community behaviour. If the more we model the kind of behaviour we want to see in our community, the more likely it is that our community will reflect that as well, because leadership sets the tone. And I'll leave it at that, so that you can do the closing remarks, Sue. Just a reminder, we are back on Sunday. Quick plug for the next show. We're back on Sunday for a Sunday session. We will do a session next Tuesday on the last policy area, but we'll post that one online. But we won't be doing a Friday session next week because it's the last day of the election. If you haven't voted, please get out there and vote. This election is really important to the future of Frankston, and I think there are 6 people on this screen that you can trust to do the right thing. Sue, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, and thanks everybody for your contributions today and for listening in. I think the key thing with being inclusive is to set ourselves up with an opportunity to look through the lens of these different groups of people, to really see what they see and get feedback on how they experience what they experience about the way the community supports them, or does things for them, or hears them. So where there's a Disability Access and Inclusion Committee, there could be different focus groups or work groups for all of the minority groups within our community, where they're invited to give their views on policy approaches, things that are working, things that are not working. It does take some proactivity. It takes a commitment to want to hear from the community. But I think that is in council's gift, because we are here to represent everyone in the community. So that, I think, is certainly something that's very important for us all as potential councillors to think about going forward. But thank you everyone for being here today. It's been a pleasure to raise some sometimes quite difficult topics to talk about, but I think that's the whole point. We've got to be brave and tackle the harder topics as well as the more straightforward ones. So thanks everyone. Have a great day.
Right.
Thank you, Frankston.